mathematics learners, welcome to Distance Learning with Lee, where I make learning mathematics super easy. On today's video tutorial, guys, we are going to be diving deeper into the topic of taxation, right? And I'm going to be focusing more on what rebates are, what does tax threshold mean, and I'm going to be focusing on how the rebates, right, affect the total amount of tax, right, that a person will have to pay. And before starting any topic, it's very important that we basically define what it is that we're actually talking about in this topic. What is taxation, guys, right?
So taxation is a term that is used for when a taxing authority imposes financial obligations to its citizens, right? So when a person basically pays tax, right, the government goes into your salary and takes a particular percentage of the salary so that the government can cover particular goods and services that the government provides for the citizens of the country, right? So when a person gets taxed, right, they look at the tax brackets that your income falls into, and a certain percentage is taken by the government depending on the tax bracket that your income falls in, right? And that money is basically used to pay for goods and services of the citizens of that country, right?
The amount that a person pays, right, towards their tax is affected by a number of factors, right? It is affected by the salary that a person earns per annum, okay? Because if we know how much a person earns per annum, right, then we are able to basically determine the tax bracket, right, that a person falls in, right? And that will basically help us determine the rate of tax that they would then have to pay. Okay, right? So how much a person earns, right, helps us determine the amount of tax that they need to basically pay. Okay, what else also affects how much tax a person will basically have to pay is the rebates, okay, right? And in this case, right, a person's age helps us determine, okay, what type of rebates they basically qualify for, right? And then once we are able to basically determine the type of rebates that a person qualifies for, then we are able to basically subtract that from the tax that we've already basically calculated. Okay, so but I'm gonna dive deeper into all these definitions. Okay, so we're gonna get started with the first definition that is very important when we basically doing our taxation calculations, right? And that is tax threshold. Okay, so you're gonna see this term very often in your taxation calculations, right? And it's very important that you guys understand what is a tax threshold. So a tax threshold helps us determine whether a person, okay, should pay tax or not. Okay, so let me just give you guys a practical example to basically help you guys understand the concept of tax threshold. Okay, let's say for example you are told that, right, for you to be able to get into the bus, right, you need to have 5 rand to go into the bus to go to your destination. Okay, so the bus fare, okay, or the amounts that you basically need, right, to get into the bus to get to school is 5 rand. Okay, so what that basically means is that if you have less than 5 rand, you cannot get into the bus. Okay, so our threshold is 5 rand, because that amount basically helps us determine whether you can or cannot get into the bus. Okay, so similarly, with your tax threshold, right, you'll be given an amount. Okay, for example, looking at this particular table that I'm sharing here on the screen, right, we are given the tax threshold, right? We are told that if you are below the age of 65, Meaning if you are 64 years old, 63 years old, right? The tax threshold is 83,100. So basically what this means is that if you earn an income that is below this amount, right? That basically means that you don't have to pay tax, okay? But if you earn an amount that is above 83,100, right? In other words, if you earn an amount that is 83,101, 120 rand, right? That basically means that you need to basically pay tax, right? So, in essence, right, the tax threshold helps us determine whether a person is eligible, okay, to pay tax. Okay, so a tax threshold helps us determine whether an individual is eligible to pay tax. Okay, so if an amount is below the tax threshold, that means that you do not have to pay tax. Okay, and if an amount is above the tax threshold, that means that you do have to pay tax. Okay, so going back to the example that I basically gave you guys about the bus fare being 5 rand, right? I explained that if you have an amount that is below 5 rand, right? Okay, because our threshold is 5 rand, right? That means that if you have less than 5 rand, you cannot go into the bus, okay? But if you've got more than 5 rand, you can go into the bus because you can basically afford to pay for the bus fee. Okay, so that's basically what tax threshold is, guys. And it's very important that you understand this because it comes in a lot in your taxation questions. Okay, so let's basically look at one question just so that I can reinforce and make sure that you guys understand what tax threshold is. Okay, so let's look at this example. It says Paul is 60 years old, okay, and he earns 83,000 per annum. Okay, we're given the question, does Paul have to pay tax? All right, so we know that Paul is 60 years old. We know that Paul earns 83,000 per annum, per year. In a year, that is how much he earns, right? And we want to basically determine if he has to pay tax. Okay, so now to answer this question, we need to basically look at our tax threshold table. Okay, in our tax threshold table, we see on the left column, okay, we are given the age, okay, right? We are told here if you are below the age of 65 years, meaning if you're 64, 63, 62, the tax threshold is 83,100. Okay, if you're between the ages of 65 to below 75, the tax threshold is 128,650. And we're told if your age is 75 years and older, meaning 75, 76, all the way up until however old you are, that is above 75, right? The tax threshold is 143,850. Okay, we already know that the tax threshold helps us determine whether a person is eligible or not. Okay, eligible means whether a person qualifies or not to basically pay for their tax, right? In this case, we are told that Paul earns 83,000 per annum. Okay, so what does that mean? It basically means that, okay, if Paul is 60 years old, that means that he falls within that first row, okay? Right? And we are told that now for the first row, if you are at an age that is below 65 years, right? The tax threshold is 83,100. Okay. So now we basically need to now determine whether Paul's annual income, right, is below or above this tax threshold, right? Is his annual income greater than or less than that 83,100? Let's see. Okay, so 83,000 is actually less than 83,100 because 83,100 is more than 83,000. So what we can basically see that is that Paul's annual income is actually below the tax threshold. Okay. And we know if an amount is below the tax threshold, what does that mean? You do not have to pay tax. Okay. So let's say, for example, Paul earns, okay, let's just change the question. Okay. I added an additional question. Let's say they say that Paul is 60 years old still, right? And he earns 83,600 per annum. Okay. So now we already know that if you're at an age that is below 65 years old, right? The tax threshold is 83,100, okay? But now, if he earns 83,600 per annum, now we must basically determine, is that amount above, is it more than, or less than the tax threshold? Okay. In this case, we would see that 83,600 is actually more than or above the tax threshold. So in this case, he would have to pay tax, right? Okay. But then if his annual income is below the tax threshold, he does not have to pay tax. Okay. So this is a very important concept that you guys also need to understand for taxation, guys. This is just tips to help you better understand this, right? And to help you approach questions that deal with tax threshold. Okay, so that is it about tax threshold. I hope I've basically clarified that concept. So now let's go to another term that you guys will see a lot when it comes to your tax calculations, right? And that term is your rebate. Okay, so what is a rebate, guys? Okay, so in the other video tutorials, I also mentioned that it's a refund that you get, right, from your tax, right? And you can also say that a rebate, right, is a relief that people get according to their age. Okay, so let's say, for example, you've basically calculated the total amount of tax that you are supposed to pay, right? And you still need to take into consideration a rebate if you're given a rebate table. Okay, so a rebate, right, is a refund or a relief that people get, okay, according to their age, right? So once you basically have basically, or once you are given a person's age, right, and we are given your rebates table, you are able to basically determine a rebate that a person qualifies for, right? And once you basically have that rebate, you basically subtract that rebate from the annual tax payable, right? And there are three different categories for your rebate, right? You get your primary rebate, okay. So when it comes to your primary rebate, everyone qualifies for the primary rebate, okay. So if you are 25, 35, 65, you qualify to basically get your primary rebate, okay. And if you are between the ages of 65 years to 75 years, you qualify to get both the primary as well as the secondary rebate. And lastly, if you are over the age of 75, then you would then qualify for the primary, secondary, and tertiary rebates. Okay, three of those. So you'd basically add the amount for the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary, and you'd subtract that from whatever annual tax amount that you've basically calculated. Okay, so let's just put all of this in context by actually looking at examples. Okay, let's look at this worked example. It says consult the tax table for individuals for 2020 to 2021 tax year to answer the questions that follow. Okay, right, I'm just going to use this table here. So I'm just going to change this and make it 2018 to 2019 tax year to answer the questions that follow. All right, question 1.1. Into which tax brackets does a person who earns a taxable income of 454,563, which tax brackets does that person fall in? Okay, so if you basically have a look at this table, we need to basically determine, right, where does 454,563 fall? Where does that amount fall? Okay, so when you see here, I'm just going to call this the one. Okay, I'm going to call this the first tax bracket, second tax bracket, third tax bracket, fourth tax bracket, fifth tax bracket, sixth tax bracket. This is the seventh, okay? So when we basically look at all these tax brackets, right? Where does this amount fall? Okay, so we see that the amount of 454,563, okay, falls within the fourth tax bracket, okay, because that amount is in between 423,301 and 555,600. Okay, so therefore we can basically conclude that that amount falls within the fourth tax bracket. Okay, question 1.2, which rebate would a 52-year-old person receive? Okay, so now we're going back to our rebate, right? We already know that a rebate, right, is a relief or a refund that a person basically gets, okay, depending on their age, right? And if that person, we are told that is a 52-year-old person, we need to basically determine, do they fall within the primary rebate? Do they fall within the secondary rebate? Do they fall, or do they fall in the tertiary rebate? Okay, so let's see here. Looking at our rebate table, okay, we see that if you are a 52-year-old, right, then we know that if they give you a table that says the primary rebate is for everyone that is under the age of 65, right? Therefore, a 52-year-old would qualify to just get a primary rebate. That's it. So let's say, for example, we had already calculated the total tax that they had to pay. Then we would then have to then subtract this 14,067 from that amount. Okay. So in this case, if a person is 52 years old, that person only qualifies to get what, a primary rebate. Okay. Let me just add an additional question to just help us better understand the concept of rebates. Now, let's say you are let me add an additional question here. Okay, so I've basically added an additional question. Let's say they asked you, which rebate would a 67-year-old person receive? Okay, remember from the previous explanations, I explained that everyone qualifies for the primary rebate. So it doesn't matter if you're 65, 60, whatever, everyone, okay, qualifies for the primary rebate. So we already know that a 67-year-old would qualify for the primary rebate, right? As well as looking at this table here, we are told that a secondary rebate, for you to get a secondary rebate, right, you need to be between the ages of 65 to 75 years old. Okay, so in this case, if a person was 67 years old, right, they would qualify to get what? Both the primary rebate as well as the secondary rebates. Okay, so what that would mean is that from the annual tax income that you would have calculated, you would then have to then subtract the secondary rebate as well as the primary rebate. Okay, so let's basically answer that quickly. Okay, a person that is 65 years old would receive or would qualify to get the secondary rebate. Okay, and that is that. Okay, let's look at question 1.3. It says, explain whether a 65-year-old earning 120,000 should pay tax or not. Okay, so this question basically taps into our tax threshold discussion. Okay, so if a person is earning 120,000, right, and that person is 65 years old, right, should they pay tax or not? Okay, so we have to basically look at our tax threshold table, okay, because that'll help us basically determine what is happening. Okay, what is happening in the first row? It says that if you are under the age of 65, guys, sorry for the typing errors. Okay, I got this. This is a resource from the Department of Education. Okay, so if you're under the age of 65, the tax threshold is 78,150. Okay, but this person in particular is not under the age of 65. They are actually 65 years old, right? So we are basically focusing our attention on this row here, okay? Because that row tells us that if you are between the ages of 65 to 75 years old, right, the tax threshold is 121,000, meaning if you earn an annual income that is less than 121,000, you don't have to pay tax. But if you earn an annual taxable income that is above 121,000, that basically means that you have to pay tax. Okay, so in this case, we are told the 65-year-old earns 120,000. Okay, and 120,000 is actually less than 121,000. Okay, so that basically tells us that he doesn't have to pay tax. Okay, so the tax threshold is 121,000. He earns 120,000, and we see that this amount is actually below the tax threshold, or it's less than. Okay, therefore we can conclude that he doesn't have to pay tax. All right, okay, and that is basically it, guys, when it comes to these two important terms. Okay, your rebate and your tax threshold, they're very important. Okay, because if you don't understand these two terms, you'll struggle tremendously in doing your calculations for taxation. I think I'm going to stop it here because I think it's becoming a bit too long, right? The next video tutorial, guys, we're going to just do an application question, okay, of how we basically put everything together. Okay, so please make sure that you watch that video tutorial.
That is it, guys, and I'll see you guys on my next upload, Distance Learning with Lee, where I make learning mathematics super easy. Bye, guys.